All right, so I want to make sure that everybody understands that the thyroid gland is multiple tissue types, right? There are epithelial cells in there, there's connective tissue in there, but I want to make sure that you understand it is not just a gland that produces one hormone, it actually produces two. The other hormone is called calcitonin. Besides thyroid hormone, your thyroid gland produces calcitonin, okay? Calcitonin is produced by the parafollicular cells in the thyroid gland. So if you were to, let me just grab this pen here, if you were to look at the parafollicular cells, they're just on the inside surface um, of that follicle, right? So you can see that the cells that are surrounding the follicle are right up against it. But in here, you have another cell type. I mean, they're only one cell distance away, but they're producing a completely different hormone. Now, as you can probably surmise, calcitonin is a hormone that controls the levels of calcium in the blood. If you took ANP1, you'll know that calcium is extremely important in muscle contraction, bone density, and other things. But we have to kind of understand what the mode of action is for this hormone. So I'm not going to show you another biochemical pathway. I think you kind of get the point that there are multiple steps in how hormones regulate different aspects of homeostasis. But the release of calcitonin results in lowered blood calcium. Okay, so we're talking about, what you can get in a blood test, a sample of blood. When calcitonin is released, calcium levels will drop. Free calcium ions will drop out of the blood. Now, how this works is two different mechanisms. Calcitonin inhibits osteoclast activity. Now, if you haven't had ANP1, osteoclasts are cells that will literally destroy bone tissue and release the calcium that bones hold. Why would you want to do this? You might be asking yourself, what in the heck would I have a cell for that would just destroy my bones? Well, it's to do exactly this. It's to allow calcium to be released into the blood for other purposes. So osteoclasts are going along, chewing away at your bone tissue, releasing the calcium that makes them up. Calcitonin inhibits osteoclast activity. So by turning that cell activity down, osteoclast activity down, they don't chew up as much bone, and therefore the calcium stays in the bone and doesn't go into the blood. That's how you reduce the blood calcium levels by this hormone. The other aspect of it enhances bone absorption of calcium, further pulling calcium out of the blood, right? So what would happen if your calcium would go too high? Well, lots of problems, actually. You probably wouldn't be able to control your muscles very well. And well, there's multiple other problems. It could have an effect on blood pH. There's lots of different things we could talk about. So this is maintaining homeostasis. So keep in mind, calcitonin reduces blood calcium, right? The parathyroid glands, which are just right next to the thyroid glands, I'll show you in the next slide. They're paired glands on the posterior aspect of the thyroid. So there's really a lot going on as far as the endocrine system goes in the neck, right? Thyroid's in the front of the trachea, but the parathyroid glands are on the posterior aspect of that gland. The parathyroid glands produce, as you can imagine, parathyroid hormone, or PTH. What this hormone does is that it controls calcium levels in the blood by acting as an antagonist of calcitonin. So if you think about it, what's it going to do? Lower blood calcium or raise it? Exactly right. It's going to raise blood calcium by acting the opposite way calcitonin does. So here you see the posterior aspect of the thyroid. So in other words, you would be looking at the thyroid as it was wrapped around somebody's trachea from the back of, the back of their neck, back of their head. These are the parathyroid glands. So again, another cell type, right, that are sort of embedded in the rest of the thyroid gland. And these, when PTH, parathyroid hormone, is released from these glands, it results in increased blood calcium. The adrenal glands are sort of well, it's a conglomerate of different tissues. Actually, they occur in three different layers, as you can see here on the bottom. The adrenal glands are basically living right on top of your kidneys, right? So they're like little hats that your kidneys wear, as you can see right here, in your lower rib cage, towards the posterior aspect. And they're divided into two sections. The adrenal medulla, okay, so the medulla is generally always referring to the core or the center of a structure in the body, like the medulla oblongata of the brain, right? So the medulla is the center part, whereas the cortex, just like the brain, is the outer layer. So the adrenal cortex and the medulla do two different things, which we're going to talk about in the next section here. I just want you to know that the adrenal cortex, the three layers that it's separated into, I don't really need you to memorize that stuff, but I am going to be referring to it because each one of these layers results in a different hormone being produced. Now, you should know the hormones, but I'm not going to hold you to knowing which layers they come from. I just want you to know that they're products of the adrenal cortex. So, if you look at the adrenal cortex in detail, you can see that, with the medulla on the inside, it kind of layers out towards the very outside of the gland, as I just said. So each one of these, functionally will produce another layer. Now, if we get some pig kidneys in the class, which I don't really know how labs are going to go, as I said yesterday, um, we might be able to see this, but I'll let you know about that later. So the adrenal cortex first layer is what we're going to call the zona glomerulosa. Okay, so it's associated with the kidneys, and it produces mineralocorticoids. So that's how you would pronounce that underlined statement there. Mineralocorticoids regulate ion concentration in the blood and interstitial fluid. Okay, so in other words, the amount of charged particles that you have in your blood is regulated by mineralocorticoids. The most important ones that I would like you to know, or most important one, I should guess say, that I would like you to know, is something called aldosterone. Aldosterone reduces the excretion of sodium. So in other words, what does it do? It retains sodium, right, by reducing the excretion from the body and enhances resorption. Okay, so aldosterone, in other words, holds on to sodium, from your diet in your blood for a longer period of time. If it's released, sodium levels increase or are maintained in the blood. So aldosterone is triggered by low blood volume, low blood pressure, which are correlated, and increases in potassium ion concentration. So why is this important? Well, sodium has a positive charge to it. Sodium and water, since water is polar, really like each other. So if there's sodium in the system, water is going to be basically attracted to that sodium, right? So think about it. You go and you eat a large, I don't know, pepperoni pizza, lots and lots of salt. How do you feel 2 hours later? You feel thirsty, or even during, the meal or whatever. So you drink a lot of water, and what's going to happen is the salt and the water are going to kind of like stay in the system. Well, if you put more liquid in your body, right, more whatever you're drinking, into your body, that's going to put more volume into your blood because all of that liquid that you drink goes into your bloodstream, right? Um, Meaning that you'll retain water. So aldosterone, when it's produced, if low blood volume is detected, your body will try to hold on to that sodium to increase the blood volume and therefore the blood pressure. Now, if your pressure gets too high, there's going to be another hormone that'll actually kick in there, right? So this is not only regulating blood pressure, but it's also it also reacts to increases in potassium ion concentration. Now, why is that important? Again, if you took A&P1, which I think most of you guys said you did, but for those people that didn't, it's very important to balance sodium and potassium. If you don't balance it, or if you get completely out of whack as far as sodium and potassium in proportion to each other, your sodium potassium pumps, which you probably heard of in biology, okay, so we call them the NAK pumps, right, may not work very efficiently, and you might have a problem with nerve conduction or muscle flexing or something like that. So you definitely want to keep sodium and potassium in a relatively stable proportion to each other. Um, and of course, you want to make sure your blood volume and your blood pressure doesn't go too low because obviously that could be bad too. You could pass out. Pardon me. So glucocorticoids are synthesized in that middle layer, the zona fasciculata, and this is, remember, in the adrenal cortex. Cortisol would be the most important glucocorticoid that we're going to be talking about. So cortisol is released. It's a steroid-based hormone that's released by the release of ACTH. Now, this was an amino acid-based hormone that you saw on that original chart we covered in class. Okay, and I also made a video of that too. ACTH, and therefore the release of cortisol, works to suppress immune responses. Okay, so the reason I have a picture of toes here, right? Um, you can imagine you go to get a pedicure or something like that, and they don't clean the instruments, between people, and that could relate, or that could result into an infection. Well, if you have this infection, you can't just go on this runaway train of inflammation. So what's going to happen is your body's going to start to release cortisol. Cortisol is also called the stress hormone, and when you're stressed, it tends to depress the immune response. So, what's going to prevent this from becoming a runaway immune response is the release of cortisol, in other words. Okay. It also increases blood sugar by provoking gluconeogenesis, and we're going to talk about that on the next slide. I just want to make sure you understand that, and the relevance here. Um, as I just said, cortisol is a stress hormone. You release it when you're stressed, right? Well, what's the effect of that? It suppresses your immune response. Basically, puts more energy in other things to get you out of that stressful situation, with the detriment of suppressing your immune response. Think about like when you might have actually experienced this, and you may not, have actually thought about this before, but if you think about it. I think everybody's familiar with acne. Everybody's had a breakout at some point or another. When do people generally break out? You know, pimples, or acne are little micro infections in your skin. So if you think about this, when you're really stressed, right? I don't know, somebody broke up with you. It's right before final exams. You have this major project. You just got fired, something like that, right? You produce so much of this cortisol that it reduces your immune response. Well, what normally prevents you from, breaking out in your face is your immune response. So when do you break out? You break out during stressful times. That's because cortisol is suppressing your immune response. Okay, so I just wanted to make that, clear and hopefully make that relevant to something we've all experienced. Gluconeogenesis is a really important sort of, I guess, metabolic pathway here. And I think it's pretty self-explanatory. If you break the word down, gluco means sugar, neo means new, and genesis means created, right? So really, I mean, I think it makes more sense to say the word almost backwards as far as the meanings go. We're creating new sugars. Okay, so sugars normally come from your diet. You break down carbohydrates, whether complex or simple, right? So starches and sugars, and they go into your bloodstream, and your cell uses them as the basic unit of energy for um, cell metabolism. However, if you are stressed and you just don't have a whole lot of sugars in your system, cortisol, that what we just talked about in the previous slide, can provoke or initiate, I guess I should say, gluconeogenesis. What that means is your body is going to start to make sugars from non-carbohydrate sources. So what are the non-carbohydrate sources that we're talking about here? We're talking about fats and proteins. Now, that sounds all well and good that your body can actually make the sugars that it needs from other, parts of your diet. But unfortunately, there's a waste product that's produced, which are called ketones. And we'll talk about that on a future slide once we get into diabetes. All right, the last one I wanted to talk about as far as the cortex, the adrenal cortex hormones are gonatocorticoids. They're secreted in those last couple layers, the fascicularis and the reticularis. Most of them are weak androgens. Okay, so an androgen is a precursor to testosterone. In other words, these chemicals can become testosterone and or estrogen. Estrogen and testosterone are just a shade away from each other in structure. So the picture that I have here is of Mark McGwire. Okay, he had a home run sort of kind of like almost competition back in the 2000s with another baseball player called Sammy Sosa. If you look at his build, he is huge for a baseball player, right? He was just crushing the ball every time. The reason that he did that was because it was found out he was taking androgens. He wasn't actually taking steroids or what was classified as steroids at the time. He was taking something that would make his body produce testosterone. It's kind of a way around it, and it was a really, really controversial. If you want to read more about it, you get Jose Canseco's book, about steroids in professional sports. Um, Now, normally, this plays a large role during puberty in both sexes. If you think about it, how do we initiate puberty? How do you jumpstart, the gonads, right, ovaries and testes, if, to get them started? Well, the gonatocorticoids from the adrenal glands start that process. So this is a really important driver for the beginning of puberty in both sexes, males and females.